that good note, thank you for inviting me over to your wonderful studio. It's gorgeous. I was admiring obviously your book collection, and I said your job bags as well. I thought that.
Yeah.
I love a job bag.
Yeah.
Really good. But hopefully, I don't know if you listen to any of the podcasts, but the idea is really your journey into design. What inspired you? What was the catalyst? What was the spark through to where you are today and challenges on the way? So with that,
Sounds good.
Tom, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. So what was the sort of catalyst that got you into, or the spark that got you into thinking, actually, I'm going to be a graphic designer?
I think the sort of earliest influences that inform that decision are typographic references. Seeing typefaces and recognizing that typography is an element and a medium that is designed by someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, whether it was record sleeves, whether it was titles, whether it was packaging, or whether it was book covers, having that kind of awareness. And this is going back to sort of 13, 14 years old.
I was going to say what age.
And as at school, but being really, really interested in that, or sort of starting to form an interest. And weirdly, in our school library, which is quite new for secondary school, they had Design Week.
Right.
They subscribed to Design Week, which was quite odd, because I'm not sure who else, but if there are any other people in the school that
the CD teacher or something.
Yeah.
CD, yeah.
But I did, and so it was the librarian who worked there who said, "Oh, if you're interested in lettering, there is this magazine that we get that comes in every week, and it's much more about contemporary practice, less around the historical. It's interesting, and you can sort of look at practitioners that are working now on the sorts of things that they're doing." So I think that's my sort of entry.
Right. Yeah.
And actually, reading Design Week, one of the things, the articles that was in there, is that there's an exhibition of a magazine designer called Neville Brody that's at the V&A, a kind of major retrospective of his work when he's only 32.
Yeah.
And I go and see that, after school, jump on the train. The school's in South East London. Just jump on train, go up to the V&A. And that had a huge, huge influence on me, I think, that exhibition. Suddenly you saw just possibilities of what typography can be.
Yes.
All of the different things it can be, and how experimental it can be, through obviously the lens of Neville.
Yeah.
And just how kind of exciting that was, and how he used type in such a sort of painterly way and a kind of architectural way. All of the sort of levels of it, various kind of levels of expression that he was able to achieve just through lettering was incredibly inspiring. And also then that's combined with photography. What starts to happen in that relationship of those two things. Yeah. Typography now and then the image making and photography. And I think that's really the start of it for me.
Wow. And so, well, I suppose you would have started your first portfolio without knowing it, probably to get into art college or something.
Yeah. And I think there's a few places. I ended up at what was then the London College of Printing.
Yes.
Yeah. In Elephant and Castle. Still there. They hadn't moved to Back Hill then.
Yeah.
And the reason I went on that course, I decided to go on that course, is because there was definitely a skew on that course towards typeface design and layout and lettering, as opposed to kind of image making or photography, which is what a foundation would offer you. So it was actually a BTEC.
All right. Which was it, H&D or
no? National Diploma.
Okay.
Because I was pretty certain at 16 that this is the sort of the path I wanted to tread.
Yes.
And that I was interested in. So I skipped A levels. There was no point in in doing those, I felt, at that time. And I wanted to get away from Southeast London. I wanted to get away from school. I wanted to, I was interested in other things that my, the other pupils in my class, my friends, but weren't interested in those things. If I would go up and see exhibitions at the weekend and was sort of reading about all sorts of interesting designers and just learning a lot about this whole other space. I was 15 or 16, and I think, the idea of then just sitting and doing A-levels and just treading water just seemed ridiculous to me. So, that at that time you couldn't do a foundation until you were 17.
Right.
Quite strict about it. So then you've had this kind of strange limbo year. So anyway, the BTEC was a way of being able to kind of exit school and start a design course and start learning about typography and lettering and also the history of the discipline, which I was incredibly interested in, and also with its background in teaching the process of printing. That was to me that really resonated. It was very interesting. So yeah, LCP to begin with on a BTEC, and then from there a degree at St Martin's, which of course at that time graphic design was over in Longacre.
Yeah, which is now an H&M, isn't it?
Yeah. That was a very beautiful building. It was an old former banana warehouse.
Right.
So a really interesting character. And in that building, so that was a 3-year course, obviously. And in that building, you had photography in the basement. And then you had graphic design. And then at the top of the building, you had film.
Right.
And painting and illustration. So there's a really interesting mix of courses and disciplines in that particular building. And there's still people that I'm friends with now that, we were in that building together and that we worked together. The director, Joe Wright, was on the film course when I was there, and we're still friends and we still work together now. So it was a very interesting time.
What year was that?
So I left in 1994. I graduated.
Yeah. So I was at LCP at that time doing H&D typography. But I was thinking back to all that kind of time and era. There was definitely an energy about design when you think about what was going on, and then within the art space as well. With the Tracy Emin and that kind of new wave of art and graphic design. I hate that word, graphic design, but design. There's just something about it, and obviously there's no internet and things like that. So I think we were maybe, definitely me, and that's, I suppose the whole thing of the visual was looking for references and things that excite you, right?
Definitely, and I think you're absolutely right about that time. It was that whole period of the YBAs. It was, in graphic design terms, you had people, very experienced people, why not associates, and it was that era, and Designers Republic, of course.
Yeah. Tomato and stuff.
Tomato and practices that were commercially successful, but making really, really interesting and very experimental work in most instances. And that thing, particularly with Tomato, of working across media.
Yeah.
The fact that Underworld were actually part of that collective at one time, and they were all in that building in Soho. And Grail and Simon were making experimental films as well as doing kind of print-based projects. It felt, I think, the time that I was at college and the years that follow into the sort of late 90s are a really exciting period of time in not just design, but I think anyone that's in the business of making things and creating things,
Right. So you left St Martin's. I think at that time as well, a lot of people felt confident about maybe starting their own practices. There's definitely entrepreneurship maybe within people believed. I suppose there's less. I think when I was at college, I think there's 30 in a class, right? So if you think nowadays, it's obviously probably tripled that nowadays.
Is that triple that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you think there's just a few people that will go, actually, well, let's try and do what we're doing here and make something commercial.
Yeah.
So what was your first role once you left?
I think but it's interesting that it was a very optimistic time, wasn't it? I think you definitely felt that. You felt like anything was possible.
Yeah.
I certainly remember
Yeah, but
feeling like that when I graduated.
yeah, definitely. I remember when we graduated, Ben Tappenden, hopefully you listen to this, great designer, really good. He still is a good designer. He was living in Old Street in a converted warehouse, Phipps Street, and I moved in with him. But I should, we lived with a photographer. But there's like that kind of arty cultural thing, and to go back there now would be amazing, right? It was super lucky.
Yeah.
And yeah.
But I remember, that to me was how clubs were. We went into a club. I was very involved with the Blue Note Club in Austin Square.
Oh yeah.
And all of the people that were into the same music as you and would come on to the same nights, be the filmmakers or photographers or painters or writers. Everyone had kind of really interesting roles that were in the business of making things for a living, and so many sort of kindred spirits in that sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to your question around post-graduation, I worked for a couple of smaller design studios. I needed money, after my degree show. You sort of throw everything, you invest everything you have into that sort of moment in time. So I worked for a couple of smaller studios, and then when I was at St Martin's, there was a lecturer called John Wozencroft, visiting lecturer. And John Wozencroft authored the first two Brody books. John and I got on very well, and he really sort of took me under his wing in terms of just, he knew that I would get excited about a kind of obscure music reference or an obscure photographic reference or an obscure film reference. So we sort of, developed this really interesting relationship, which continued after I graduated. And about a year after I left St Martin's, there was a vacancy at Neville's studio over in Hingston. And of course, John was still very connected with Neville and the studio there. So he put me forward for this job.
Yeah.
And I met Neville and we got on very well, and he liked my work, and so I started working at the studio.
That's amazing.
It was an interesting time.
Yeah. But to actually work with and for the person who you went to see the show at the V&A.
Yeah.
Must have been like working, I'm not going to say idols, but working with someone that you obviously kickstarted and
very
immensely admire.
Definitely. It was a huge influence. And that was such an interesting time at his studio then, because he was working on huge identity projects for Sony PlayStation, film title sequences for Michael Mann, and then corporate identities for Bannions, as well as running, the Fuse project, which was his experimental type project, anyone that doesn't know, and Front Shop, So such a brilliant kind of mix of projects that were always part of that sort of ecosystem of the studio. And that had an enormous influence on me in terms of how one runs practice and how one structures practice, and how interesting it is to work across sectors, and indeed across, to be multidisciplinary, and how that influences, how you can cross-pollinate between those things, in the way that you approach projects, and how one working in one area can actually have influence on another. It's an interesting way to practice, I think, and one that, it's definitely part of our approach the way that we think about things here, and the way we structure things here.
I was just admiring your typographic posters over there, which you've done in, I think it was 2011, I think the pencil said.
2011, yeah, it was a while ago. That was for a mobile phone company in Denmark.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was from a thought piece that they commissioned, which was a textbook.
Yeah.
It was a magazine. That was the kind of format that it took. It was a printed magazine, a journal, and then the prints that you see on the wall are basically extractions from that journal that are then enlarged and turned into limited edition prints.
Yeah.
That's interesting. But yeah, I worked at Neville's for 2 years, and it was a really interesting time. There was some really brilliant people at the studio then, and as I say, that the mix of projects and the types of work that we were doing was so varied and very diverse, and of course that sort of energy of bouncing from one thing to another, and having to sort of challenge your brain and problem solving very different ways. That I always found that very exciting. And about sort of 2 years in, as I say, I then started to think, well, perhaps it might be interesting to go and work on my own,
Right.
and my own clients. And what had been happening whilst I was at Neville's was in the evenings and sort of out of main working hours, I'd started to do sort of freelance, very small freelance jobs for friends who had starting record labels, or who were releasing records, themselves, or who were starting club nights. And so it was all kind of very niche and quite small work. But to your point, I had so many friends that were starting little businesses, little labels and club nights, and it was a very kind of entrepreneurial period in that sense. There were all sorts of things sprouting up everywhere. Some successful, some less so,
Give it a go.
Exactly. So I set up the studio. I took a desk space in an office over in Brewer Street in Soho. That's the beginning of January 1997.
Wow. That's 97 you were there.
Yeah. And that desk space over the next 20 years, first of all, it was a storeroom for a record label. So it had some boxes at the back.
Right.
And first of all, the boxes went, and we took the whole room.
Yeah.
Then we took the room above that. And then we took the room opposite that. So it was one of those very narrow Victorian buildings.
Right.
Sort of nestled between two larger entities at the sort of Regent Street end of Brewer Street, just behind Government Square.
Right.
And we sort of grew into the building.
That's brilliant.
As we gradually became bigger, and it was such a great place to be. I loved it when we were first there. The energy of Soho, and it was at that time when I first started the studio, it was very much a community of design businesses that were all kind of nestled in that kind of square mile, Soho. You had people like Alan Abood were there, Tomato were obviously there.
Yeah.
All of the post-production houses were there. It was fun. There was a brilliant energy, and it was a bit like being kind of living in a sort of little village. You go out or at lunchtime, or you walk to work. As you were walking to work in the morning, you'd see everywhere. You'd see your neighbours, all of your peers. It was great. It was a really, really great time, actually.
Yeah, I think David Quay had a studio there, Free de Sac, because I swear I went there, and there's like Automata around the corner, or literally next door or something. So yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
It's fun. Yeah. Well, I think everyone was either there or they were over in Hingston. There was sort of two neighbourhoods,
Yeah. I do remember the Blue Note. You've just taken me back. So when we were living in Fitz Street, I think at Hoxton Square, you had a cab stall.
Yeah.
And you come out where the 333 is, and there's nothing there, a kebab shop.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was it.
That's it.
And then you go there now, and it's absolutely grand.
You had 333, you had the Bricklayers Arms,
Yeah.
and you had the Blue Note,
Yeah.
which was obviously the basic def prior to that. That was it. And then that cab office.
Yeah, that was it. The good thing was I could just walk home. Then you had the strong room was there,
Yeah.
which was because my way into design was I did work placement as a wee teenager. Lucky enough for Malcolm Garrett at Assorted Images, which it was on that road, which is now the strong rooms, I think. So that was my moment where I was like, wow, that's it. And I was obviously so grateful for that. And looking back on it, but that sort of area and even now, like if you go up there now, it's great seeing all the sound really old, like the young people of what we were 30 odd years ago around there, and that community of creativity.
Yeah, it's got that buzz, isn't it? Still, which is lovely to sort of to see still. So, yeah, Holston Square was an important place for me. The Blue Note Kill climb. I did visual identities for pretty much every night that was on there. So from Talvin Singh's Anoka to Giles Peterson's Far East, it's a real kind of mix of musical genres and personalities, and it was interesting. It was an interesting time. Flyers and posters and the identities for club nights, they're so transient. They have like such a short lifespan. So it's fun. So you can just try stuff and experiment, and you can afford to sort of make mistakes, that people don't really notice, and then you move on to the next thing. So it was a great sort of interesting area to sort of cut your teeth in that respect.
The music side of design, was that something you wanted to do as opposed to the sort of the more corporate-y stuff, or was it just a natural path?
It was. Yeah, I think it's a few people have asked me this. I think it definitely wasn't a conscious thing.
Right.
I mean, what was conscious was that I wanted to do work that was interesting and to some degree experimental.
Yeah.
But also kind of have the autonomy to do that, to make my own decisions about things. And I think music obviously allowed me to do that, and in all sorts of interesting ways. I think the other thing that sort of resonated with me in music is that kind of whole thing around collaboration.
Yeah,
I've always really enjoyed collaborative relationships, and I think really from the outset, working with musicians or producers has always had a kind of collaborative element to it in terms of having you build and make something together. And that always really, really interested me. Because you don't always have that with the clients from, say, a brand, for example, that they're very happy to just hand that over to you and then give you a kind of, because you're the expert in that field.
Yeah.
So it works in a slightly different way.
So how does it work, the collaboration? Do you meet the artist, or do you get, I suppose, like maybe years ago it'd be like a demo cassette or a vinyl, and then you listen and interpret what that expression is? How does it work?
It's completely, it varies.
Right. Okay.
Enormously.
I was waiting for the magic.
Yeah. No, it varies enormously, and the more interesting projects, I would say, are those where the artist does have kind of visual ideas and visual thoughts.
Right.
Not necessarily where you're going to end up as a final campaign image or final cover, but certainly there's thoughts and themes and feelings that are connected to the piece of music that they have made or they are in the process of making.
Right.
It works both ways. Sometimes people would come to us at the end of that process and say, right, the album's finished, I'm ready to talk about album now, or more interesting ones, they come to you whilst they're still making a record and say, I've got these thoughts, come hear some music, come talk about what we've been thinking in terms of ideas and thematics, and then you gradually forge what that thing is, what that expression is.
So have you been invited to a studio to listen to this?
Yeah, it works. As I say, it works both ways. The more interesting projects are when you are brought on quite early on in the process, and it is collaborative, and you're part of the sort of creation of that whole thing as package.
Yeah.
not just putting the icing on the cake, as it were. It's interesting, but I do and have always really enjoyed the process of a collaborative dialogue between myself and a band or an artist. And equally that extends into how you might actually make that piece of work, whether it's collaborating with a painter or a photographer or a filmmaker, and that part of the process is really exciting. And collaboration is a big part.
Because you know what I'm going to ask you about, because I put it in the email.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So was it about
1998.
1998. So I would have been traveling into London on a bus. Yeah, I moved to Camberwell, so I would have been going into London 176 or 68 from Camberwell over the water. And I remember seeing the Massive Attack mezzanine, and I was just like, whoa. Even today, I look at that and I think, what is it? And then obviously it is the Nick Knight and your good self with Massive Attack. And just hearing you say about the collaboration, was that an image was given? Was it a commission? Was it something that they've seen or you've seen and it's kind of came together? Any stories about that?
Yeah, it's, again, very interesting period. The studio's established for a year.
Well, exactly. You're only a year into it.
And, doing lots of smaller independent label work. Some stuff at EMI and some of the bigger labels, but primarily it's very much working for independents, right? And a friend of mine who was actually the photo editor ID magazine introduced me to Band's manager. They were in the process of working on Mezzanine, and they had a working relationship with another design studio, and they were quite keen to explore the idea of just working with an individual as opposed to a kind of studio of people. And Robert from the band, who's obviously the sort of front man, is very involved with all of the visual decisions.
Yes.
The band make artwork, videos, live shows. And the two of us met, Robert and I met, and we got on very well. And that's where the process started. And initially, it was a sort of exchange of references, which is quite often how things, start. You talk about set themes in a first conversation, and then you gather visual references that's kind of responding to that conversation. And in that exchange of references, quite early on, Robert had all these like very high contrast color photocopies of spider skin. And he had this kind of obsession with insects,
Right.
specifically spiders. And he'd been using it as source material for his paintings. And texturally, and the sort of visceral feeling that he had was really interesting, but as covers in themselves, they're just sort of textures of skins. And they weren't, they didn't probably serve as imagery for a cover in themselves, but the idea of that sort of opened up this other conversation. And I've recently around that time, been introduced to Nick Knight, the photographer. And Nick had done this project at the Natural History Museum where he'd gone through and photographed huge amounts of their archive, which is all stored away. So insects, really interesting kind of plant specimens, and all sorts of wonderful and really beautiful objects that are part of their sort of stored archive that one doesn't get to see. And in and amongst that, those studies were these photographs of beetles, which are absolutely beautiful. And then beautiful in themselves, but obviously then shot by Nick, the still guys. So there was something really interesting about those that really resonated. So I introduced Robert to Nick, and Nick shared all of those pictures of insects. And there was something we started then. Nick said, "Look, if you want to do something with the light, I'd be delighted, I'd be very happy." And it thematically it fitted with everything that the record was sort of shaping up to be. There was something quite dark about that record. There was something quite quite oppressive.
Yeah.
The other thing about that record is it's about being in a kind of hybrid state, hence the title Mezzanine, because it's in between level. And there was something interesting about the sort of treatment of those insects in as much that they're almost like very black and glossy and shiny in how they're presented, but they had a very kind of dark undercurrent. So there was something interesting about all of the sort of fusing all of those things. And then Nick, in parallel, had also been doing studies in breakers' yards of cars that are just about to be crushed or have been crushed. And he suggested that we explore bringing these two things together. So the kind of crushed up textures of these cars and attaching those and blending those into the images of the Beatles, so brushing that into their armor and so on. So you have these kind of imperfections and these flaws that are generated through the crushed car components, which then makes the Beatles feel even more machine-like in their appearance. And so you're not, although you look at it and you think you recognize what it is, you're not entirely sure what that thing is that you're looking at. Although there's familiar characteristics your brain is telling you understand. So that's sort of how that came around, really. Yeah, it's the interesting collaborative triangle between the three of us. And I think that the other thing that was very interesting about that is that before I had been introduced to the Downs, Robert had always done the Downs artwork, so it was his paintings, or his collages. And because of the shift and the change in musical direction of that album, he was very open to taking a different approach with this and a new approach. And so instead of him being the image maker as such, as it were, he was happy to take on a more art directorial role with me. And Nick was obviously the image maker. But interestingly enough, it's still collage. It's the collage of kind of, sampled pieces from an insect or a cars that are then being assembled together, which, synergy between that and how they make music is very direct, So there's an interesting kind of set of parallels going on there.
It's awesome.
And also we wanted to, the colour was a very deliberate decision.
Yeah.
You got to remind yourself of the context in which those posters and that artwork sits, and it's the kind of boom era of the CD, like it's the Spice Girls era. It's when Virgin Records are at their kind of peak, and there's Blur, Pulp, all of those bands had very colourful artwork at that time.
Yes.
And it is the time of fly posters, right? So
Yes.
Certainly in any major city, right? And so you've got, the sort of urban fabric was, these fly posters are really colourful and really poppy, and it definitely represented a certain sort of genre of music in that time. And we wanted something that was the antithesis of that. And so the monochromatic imagery is definitely a kind of reactionary thing to what's happening around us at that time, and that we knew that would just cut through. I mean, not only the subject matter of the image or imagery itself, but its color palette and its starkness, and its directness was all very deliberate.
For me, it almost feels like one of those timeless classic bits of design and photography.
Yeah.
It's relevant then as it is now, and probably in about 20 years' time. It's just.
I mean, it's just. I think a lot of that's to do with the record as well. It's such an amazing piece of music, and all of the singles off that album, which everyone's so familiar. It was an enormously successful album.
Yeah.
And I think that the artwork's obviously synonymous with the success of that record in itself. So, it's interesting. And we looked at, colour versions of all of those compositions,
Right.
and, bringing a coloured accent in and playing with that. And every time we just said, there's just something kind about the brutal simplicity of that black and white version that just cuts through.
Yeah.
And we also said, if we do introduce colour, will we be kicking ourselves in 10 years' time? It's too late then. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I'm glad we all made the decision that we did. And the only colour actually on the whole package is on the CD, because obviously that's still in the CD era, is fluorescent orange.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think it's on the record. Is it on the record label? Is that...
It's on the record label.
Yeah.
It doesn't have quite the same sort of impact as you pull it out the sleeve, and have quite the same element of unexpectedness that the CD had.
Yeah. Thinking back to that time, different studio, which we've mentioned earlier, but Mark Farrow's Manic Street Preachers.
Yeah.
I remember was it A Design for Life came out? They're just silver, just debossed.
Yeah.
So nice.
So nice. I mean, I think all of that sort of that era of
Was in
that late 90s, early 2000s era. All of those Pet Shop Boy covers are amazing. The Manics covers are beautiful. Spiritualized was really amazing, wasn't it? Absorbed by the Eye.
Yeah.
He was on fire, wasn't he? In terms of their very terrific output.
Yeah.
But really, really beautiful sleeves. I think what Mark did actually that was flip the whole thing around. The CD. People will constantly kind of complaining about that as a format and how it diminish, the canvas and the opportunity and blah blah blah. And Mark said, well, no, actually, you flip that on its head. It is different, but it's something really precious actually, and you treat it as a very precious object, which of course that's what he does. All of us sleeves do exactly in their different ways, and he made some really beautiful packaging. I think some of the best CD packages came from Mark's at that time.
The one I always remember is the face with the light, the spiritualized that you.
Artist, and you get the inversion. Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. That thing of tangibility, that is so good.
Yeah, and I think all of his memorable covers do that, don't they? Whether it was the Deboss Nanate cover, whether it's the Spiritualized Pill, whether it's the Spiritualized cover you just mentioned, or that he did a really beautiful cover for techno producer Dave Clark, which had a perforated script.
Archive 1.
Archive 1. Which again is beautiful. I know so many people have got 2 copies of that.
Yeah, one opened and one not. Yeah.
Same with
Yeah, typical. Yeah, I'm a little bit like that. Get 2 copies, one open, one not. And we've spoken about music, and now you're into the motion graphics.
Yeah.
So, and obviously that sort of may have happened at the time. Seeing Neville Brody doing it, and then now you doing it. Is that a similar process with the collaborations?
Very much so. Yeah. It was interesting with your question earlier around, was it intentional to get into music? It was intentional to do really interesting work with people that really supported that, really understood, and were interested in being great collaborators. And so wherever that takes you, and so film is an extension of that. Even more so, I think that the whole of the film industry is kind of rooted in this ideology around working as a team and collaborating. The scale of the projects, the scale of your productions, no one is working for the same cause. And so it's incredibly enjoyable to be a small part of that large process when you're working on titles, because you do work very closely with director, you do work very closely with editor and the exec producers, and in some instances, like the Jackal titles that we did at the end of last year,
Right.
you work with the talent, and sort of the talent, partly because we had to shoot them, but especially for the sequences, but also because, quite often the lead talent is also now part of the exec production, team. So they're part of the decision-making process, creative. So I find it really enjoyable. I find it very rewarding. And I think that anything that has that sort of collaborative energy attached to it is always gonna, it's a really interesting learning curve, I think, as well. So film and titles and big part of what we do. So yeah, very very fortunate in that respect. But as I say, the intention was always to work across different sectors and explore um, different ways of thinking on problem solving and seeing how you can create really exciting opportunities out of those relationships.
Bet you're glad you got on that bus to V&A, aren't you?
Yeah, trading the past actually.
And you probably can't say design has its ups and its downs. Have there only been any sort of low moments or words of advice that someone, Neville might have said, or Nick, anyone could have said to you that you sort of hold on to and you think, actually, that's a nice bit of advice?
Yeah, this is an interesting question with different parts of the ways of answering it. Certainly, in terms of advice, there was something that Neville said to me once, which was when I was working with him, he would always say that, because we would talk a lot about how prolific his output was, and he would always say to me, if you're lucky enough to have been born with a gift, then you have a responsibility to use that and use it wisely and work hard, which is of course so true.
Yeah.
And as you get older, you realise that not everybody, has something that they understand that they can go to, and they don't, so many people. So I have so many friends that sort of, it's a slightly aimless wander through their life and through their career because they're not entirely sure. They don't find their purpose till much later. And if you have that gift, then you have an understanding, how they on, and you have a responsibility to use it, which of course is
True. Yeah.
yeah. And don't waste it. And it's good advice. I think if you run a business, I think that it undulates, doesn't it? It's, as we were saying in the beginning, it's challenging. It can be hugely rewarding and really exhilarating and very exciting. And it's wonderful having, a team of your own people working together. And I think there are periods what you go through where you do sort of challenge yourself and you think, is this the right thing to be doing?
Yeah.
And I think it was reassuring talking to other people that have their own businesses and their own studios, is that we all experience the same problems in different ways.
I was going to jump back to about 96, 97. Like, if you think of Attic, I remember when Attic launched their first book, I think it was with the flock wallpaper.
That's right.
They had the party at the aquarium down in Old Street.
They did, didn't they?
They did indeed. And everyone got a book. Some people might say it was self-indulgent, but you look back at it and you think that's almost trying to release creativity and see where it goes. And I don't know if studios do that anymore. And I think I suppose that's what a website is for now. But
Yeah.
there's that thing of producing and celebrating with other people within
The team.
yeah. And wider, right? They were getting it in the bookshops in like Shipman's on yeah.
I think, as you say, there's different output now. People start Instagram feeds now, and they put all of that R&D development work. Have Builders Clubs just launched something that's so similar.
Right.
It's almost their experimentation that doesn't have anywhere to go or sit necessarily.
Yeah.
It taps to a larger project, and then it sort of gets archived, and so that then it just started a feed, which is great because it's all of their out hours stuff as well. So it's we do encourage it, and actually one of the things in terms of our working practice is because we are a mix here of what I would describe as more traditional graphic designers, digital designers, and then motion designers. When a project comes in, everyone generally works together. The source projects we bring in encourage that cross-pollination between the different disciplines in the studio, which is partly what makes it very exciting. But in order to sort of find the right balance, there's a lot of R&D that goes on, and we try and structure projects so that there is more upfront time. You tend to take a bit of time out of the delivery part of the schedule and put it into the upfront part, so there's more time for ideation and development, and time to sort of figure out what the shape of that thing might look like. And then once you find it, it then starts to move, everything starts to move quite quickly after that. And so there is a lot of R&D and a lot of sort of interesting exploration, visual exploration that comes out of the beginning of any project in the studio.
Has there ever been, you've presented something but you think, oh God, I hope they don't go with that?
That's another good bit of advice, is that if you're not sure about it,
Don't
you
put it up on the wall.
Don't put it in your depth.
Yeah.
And if that means you've only got 2 routes or 1 route, it doesn't matter.
No.
Because if you can't stand behind it and 100% study, and you do have to challenge yourself, because in the momentum and the sort of the build-up before any, particularly a big client meeting, you're focused on that meeting and what's going to happen in that meeting to the extent, are you? So it is easy to sort of put something in, you think, well, that's fine. Overall, that feels like a good, healthy presentation. But then this question you have to ask yourself, to your point, what happens if they pick that? And you've got to sit there and craft it.
Yeah, for a couple of months, and you'd be bored of it after. Why did they choose that one?
So you got to really push yourself on that front. If there's any uncertainty or any doubt, take it out.
Like that.
You've got to, and you'll thank yourself afterwards.
Yeah.
Rather than kick yourself, but you left it in.
And I think that's same with student portfolios. Just 5 projects, just the best. I always remember when I went for a job at Bostock and Pollock with Nick Pollock. Yeah. And best question, I still ask it today. He said, which is the one project that represents you? And a bit of work we did years ago, me, Ben Tappington and John Crawford. Graham Atkinson back in about 96, out of college, and it was for Wimbledon School of Art. It's just really nice typographic. And I was like, it's that one. It went, yeah, totally. It's just something
Lovely.
Which I thought was really nice.
That's a really nice question, isn't it?
Yeah, I always ask that.
Yeah. And it doesn't take long, for someone to actually think and go, well, there's this one. There'll be one, always. Having a really kind of strict curatorial eye on what you're actually presenting as your portfolio online. And then, of course, if you have a meeting, there's an inquiry, then you show, you do a presentation, you show a lot more. But in terms of your front-facing portal, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Have you ever thought about doing your own book?
We've had a number of discussions about it. Yeah. And there's certainly enough work to do.
I was going to say, well, just the stories that we spoke about as well are really nice to...
it would be interesting, wouldn't it? I think now's a good time. And I think, I think there was a moment in time where I felt like, okay, yeah, we've got great audiobook music, and we've sort of dabbled in some other things, or we're in the infancy of exploring other sectors. But I feel like, certainly your reading image, we've been working within that space for quite some time now, and create I think some interesting work. And so it feels like visually it would be a more balanced book, because it would have different sectors, but there's a significant amount of work on each. It doesn't feel too weighted on the music side, if that makes sense. And yeah, with interesting stories and anecdotes to accompany those works. We've been really lucky in that we've had the opportunity to work with some amazing, artists and musicians, some amazing directors, some amazing, and brilliant creators, of our time. So they, if you are lucky enough to have worked in that way, then of course there's always interesting stories attached to a project.
No, that's
So some of which you can talk about.
the which you tell you have to buy me a drink to find out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Tom, thank you ever so much for agreeing and talking for well over an hour. It goes quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's been brilliant, and thanks so much.
Great.